5 years ago today, New York's children left school for the weekend like any other Friday, except they were told not to come back on Monday. The coronavirus pandemic was shutting everything down. The cost of that dramatic and confusing time in education is still being felt in classrooms today. That's today's story of the day.
Support for Story of the Day comes from Clarkson University, offering over 95 programs of study with campuses in the Hudson Valley, Central, and Northern New York. More at clarkson.edu.
Hey, I'm David Sommerstein. It's Friday, March 14th. First up, a group of Adirondack leaders are putting their support behind the head of the Adirondack Park Agency. That's after some APA staff made anonymous allegations of bullying and intimidation at work. Emily Russell has details.
About a month ago, board members at the Adirondack Park Agency got a letter. It was from the union that represents most APA staff. The letter was endorsed anonymously by 20 APA employees and later obtained by the Adirondack Explorer. It alleges a, quote, hostile and toxic work environment, which it blames on the APA's executive management. At yesterday's board meeting, APA Executive Director Barb Rice responded to the allegations.
There's been a lot of talk about the work environment and culture at this agency. I want to make it very clear that we do not tolerate any type of bullying, intimidation, or any other toxic behavior.
A few APA staff members have come out in support of Rice's leadership and the APA's workplace. Those two went on the record with Will Doolittle, a former reporter from the Glens Falls Post-Star. They're both members of the union, but said they never saw the letter or were asked for input before it was published. One said the letter, quote, did not sound like the place I work. At yesterday's board meeting, Rice echoed that sentiment and said she stands behind her staff.
We have great people doing great work here, and they're happy and proud to be here. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise.
The Adirondack Park Agency is no stranger to conflict, though historically that conflict has been outside the agency, most notably between the APA and local towns and villages around the park. When the APA was formed in the early 1970s, many locals feared government overreach and an intrusion on their rights. But that pushback and distrust has largely evaporated. At yesterday's APA meeting, Jerry Delaney from the Local Government Review Board acknowledged that seismic shift.
If I were to have done this 50 years ago, I'd have been fired.
Delaney commended Rice's leadership of the APA. Since she took over 3 years ago, he said there's been more communication and honesty between the APA and local governments. At yesterday's meeting, he presented 3 resolutions of support for Rice, including from the town of Indian Lake, from the Adirondack Association of Towns and Villages, and from the Essex County Board of Supervisors.
Essex County formally declares full confidence in Executive Director Rice's administration and guidance of the agency and wishes her well setting this cooperative direction of the Adirondack Park Agency for the next 50 years.
After the letter from anonymous staff was published last month, the APA said it's been working with the state's Office of Employee Relations to, quote, ensure a safe working environment. Emily Russell, North Country Public Radio, Raybrook.
After the COVID-19 lockdown really took effect, students wouldn't return to their classrooms until the fall of 2020, in some cases even later than that. And when they did, it was to a profoundly different educational experience. Today, Amy Feiereisel reports on the lasting impacts of COVID-19 in education.
In a global pandemic, no one is really left untouched.
Some families literally saw a loved one pass away during the pandemic.
That's Stephen Todd, District Superintendent of the Jefferson Lewis BOCES, which serves 18 school districts near Lake Ontario.
Even the students and adults who came through the pandemic, the most unscathed, if you will, still experienced loss.
Lost social interaction, lost routine and normality. A lot of people talk about the pandemic as an accelerator and amplifier. It took existing issues, both behavioral and academic, and made them a lot bigger. Across the U.S., reading and math scores dropped and are still below pre-pandemic levels. Educators I spoke with identified students who are in 7th, 8th, and 9th grades right now as the ones struggling most academically. Those are children who were in the early grades of elementary school in 2020. Christy Moore was the principal of the Glens Falls Middle School when the pandemic started.
If the environment that they were in was staring at screens and playing video games and not having a lot of social interaction, and that's how their brain was developing, it's no wonder that we're seeing, them struggling as they're, early high school students now.
Moore is now the district's director of multi-tiered systems of support and spends a lot of her time working to get chronically absent students back in school. She says the pandemic really widened the gap between children who had stable home lives and those who didn't. Some students had really positive experiences, family time, cooking, crafting.
Those students were enriched during that time compared to the students that were experiencing additional trauma at home.
For those kids, what that looks like today is needing more help, counseling, teachers' aides, mental health supports. Moore says behavioral issues are the worst in the youngest grades, where students are still learning emotional regulation. That's been true for several years now. In 2022, I spent time with Jessica Quimby, a first grade teacher at Salmon River Elementary School.
It's been kind of crazy, like running around the room, like they're fighting with each other.
She was overwhelmed by the emotional needs of her students and the very different levels they were coming in at, some behaving like 3-year-olds instead of 6. She teared up when I asked her the first time we met how she was doing.
I'm feeling like I normally would at the end of a school year, at the beginning of a school year, which is kind of scary. How am I going to sustain this for the next 7 months? Yeah.
Many teachers say that the fall of 2020 through the spring of 2022 was the hardest period of their careers. There was quarantining, social distancing, elaborate schedule changes, limited extracurriculars, the politicization of masks. A lot of teachers left the profession. Jennifer Gaffney is the superintendent of Sackett's Harbor Central School District.
Anybody who's eligible to retire from the superintendency, from the principalship, from teaching, even from non-instructional staff positions, it was that tough.
And that was in the middle of an existing generational turnover. Tom Burns is the district superintendent of the St. Lawrence Lewis BOCES.
We were reaching that point where it was baby boomers were starting to exit the system.
Burns says the education world is facing a demographic challenge. There are just fewer Gen Xers and millennials than baby boomers, and fewer young people are entering the teaching profession. In 2025, schools are still struggling with teacher and staff shortages. 86% of districts report difficulty hiring. But it's not all doom and gloom. Educators do say that some accidental silver linings came from the pandemic. Burns says that one was the rapid reevaluation of a lot of education norms.
Change is very slow in education. We have so many different stakeholder groups and constituencies, and it's just very hard to make sometimes even the smallest of changes.
But big changes happened, often overnight. Teachers learned over a weekend how to use a suite of virtual tools like Google Classrooms, something one educator told me would have taken a decade under normal circumstances. Schools also started to move quickly away from purely punitive measures. For example, the old punishment for not coming to school was suspension. That suddenly seemed ridiculous, said Christy Moore from the Glens Falls Central School District.
A student who might be using substances outside of school. Does suspension help that, or are they just going to sit home and get high? What will help change that behavior?
New York State had already been thinking about changing graduation measures to move away from the black and white regents model. Stephen Todd says that whole process was accelerated by the pandemic. And after months of virtual learning, he says educators had a big takeaway, that nothing can replace in-person learning. He says teachers are more intentional now about removing screens from their classrooms.
Less of the let's all get out our Chromebooks and more of the let's all sit down in groups and work on Project X together and let's do this on paper together.
It'll take a lot longer than a couple of years to understand the real impact of COVID-19 on education, on kids and families, and on society as a whole. An interaction I had with a high schooler comes to mind on the day masks were no longer required in schools, early March of 2022. Aubrey Sherman was a junior at Boquet Valley's Mountain View campus in Elizabethtown.
We've lived this. This is our life. And so now to be back normal, what is that?
It's something everyone, especially kids, is still figuring out. Amy Feiereisel, North Country Public Radio.
We have more news all the time and through the weekend on our website, ncpr.org. Music today by Eddie Lawrence of Saranac Lake and Hank Soto of Stony Creek. Have a great weekend. I'm David Summerstein, North Country Public Radio.